Fun fact, through media, we can track how American culture handled certain things, like sex, cigarettes, alcohol, and even cannabis. Cannabis has become a hot topic in our country for almost a century. We're starting to pass pretty progressive laws regarding cannabis, especially considering what we thought about the drug when we first started to criminalize it. Now, before we begin, I would like to say that I am not going to get into what regulation should and shouldn't be passed regarding cannabis. This is merely a character study into the drug of marijuana and how various people have had it portrayed. Okay, let's start with a little history. So it was around the beginning of the 1900s that America's attitude toward marijuana started to change. In 1895, you can go to a pharmacy and just buy it as medicine. Around 1910, the start of the Mexican Revolution prompted a big influx of Mexican immigrants into the United States, and they brought their tradition of smoking marijuana. General prejudice and fear would soon take over from there. Rumors began to fly about how dangerous the drug was, and by extension, how dangerous the people using the drug was. People began to claim that marijuana gave an insatiable bloodlust, and that's when one man's career would gain a massive boost. Dwayne Esper was a WW1 veteran who directed and produced a number of very interesting films, such as Sex Maniac, How to Undress for Your Husband, and one of the biggest propaganda films in pot history, Reefer Madness. It was financed by a local church group, and it was usual run-of-the-mill scare tactic film. Looking back on it now, it's just funny. The melodrama, the age-old plot, and the actors' hilarious interpretations of what being under the influence of marijuana is like. Although that's probably not completely their fault, people believed marijuana was dangerous at the time and that they needed something to help drive that home. This is where propaganda comes in. People recognized the power of film and their media long ago. What we watch and what we read can affect us without even realizing it, more easily if it already aligns with the common worldviews of the time. After about 30-year time skip, we begin to see another shift in the attitude towards good old Mary Jane. The drug became the symbol of the alt culture. Writers began to write more openly about the drug, it showed up in early music videos, and began to show up in small films. Dope became the counterculture drug of choice, actually. But there was still an overwhelmingly negative connotation with the drug. The propaganda had worked its magic. Marijuana was not seen as anything remotely good by general society. In a more mainstream film called Mary Jane, which came out in the late 60s, the film definitely cast the drug in a more negative light than the actual alt culture that it represented. While the 60s brought up the idea that the whole drug use debate wasn't just black and white, I think it's fair to say that 1970 solidified it. Also during this time is when we're starting to see some more lenient laws regarding marijuana. Oregon was the first state to decriminalize it in 1973, reducing it to a $100 fine rather than jail time. There was still your films that focused more on the consequences of doing drugs, but the spotlight was on other more hardcore drugs like PCP and heroin.
I have 6 people that I counted friends who use marijuana. And they never did graduate to heroin. You know why? Because on marijuana, they committed crimes of passion and were electrocuted.
Drugs were still portrayed as generally bad and dangerous and potentially life-threatening, but weed was more of a naughty hobby. In a way, it replaced alcohol. It was kind of like the archetype of the town drunk was replaced by the town stoner. During the 70s, we also had a slight rise in marijuana humor.
God damn, looks like a quarter pounder, man.
With the 90s, the legalization movement began to become more and more popular. Part of the country was beginning to no longer see what the immediate danger to the plant was, but other parts of the country were still very against it. During this time, films involving drugs usually veered in one of two ways. The people who used them were either junkies or lazy stoners.
We like to party.
Weed being a possible gateway to harder stuff, but pretty much harmless on its own. However, the further we got into the 2000s, the more the general taboo seemed to be wearing off. People began to portray marijuana in a variety of ways. It was a fun pastime that happened to be illegal. It was a legal gray area that the American justice system had to deal with. Overall, the United States' opinion on marijuana over the last century has been anything but stagnant. Everything affects it: politics, previous generations' leftover ideals, and even the media we make when we face those ideals. And as people continue forward, the legalization movement and the world keeps on generally turning. Our opinion and portrayal of marijuana are bound to change with the times.
Now that pot is legal, what's next?